Well, today I want to start one of those series, and this series is just going to be very simply growing closer to God through understanding God, by growing in understanding of who He is. So basically, for the next 3 weeks, what I really want us to focus on is just to delve into the Bible and just really study who God is and just learn about Him. That's what I want us to focus, because the fact is, if you're probably not going to be very close to somebody who you don't know anything about. But if you know something about them, well, that makes it a little bit easier to develop a relationship with them. So, for the next 3 weeks, starting this week, we are going to be studying growing closer to God just by understanding Him better. Now, here is the seeming contradiction in that. This first week, there's something before, in order for us to start understanding God better, there's something I want us to understand that may seem to contradict that, but in reality it does not. Simply, the thing I want us to understand this week is that God is really beyond our understanding. God is massive. God is infinite. We can't really comprehend who God is. God is beyond our comprehension. God is limitless, and so we can't fully understand Him. You know, when the greatest theologians in the world sit around and talk about truths of God, they're really only scratching the surface of who He is. Now, granted, there are things about God that we do know, things that are true. But when we look at the entirety of God, we don't even come close to understanding that. So today, we're going to be looking in Genesis 1:1, because I think Genesis 1:1 tells us more about God than what our minds are capable of comprehending. Now, Genesis 1:1 very simply says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now, I want to get our point of this sermon pretty straight from the start. My job today, my goal is not that for us to learn something we're incapable of learning. But I do want us to understand exactly what it means that God is limitless, that He is beyond our comprehension. And I want us to walk away with an appreciation for God's limitless nature. So in Genesis 1:1, let's look back here. I want to look at 3 truths about God that really we can't fully comprehend. It tells us very simply, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. Now that gives us quite a few questions we can ask. That tells me something very important. If in the beginning, God, that tells me that number one, God is beyond what we understand as time. We can ask a few questions here. In the beginning of what? Well, the beginning of creation, of really existence, everything that we know. Really, it's just the beginning of time. I think God even created time here when He actually started a path for history to follow. So, here's a question. Was God before the beginning? Well, yes and no. Yes in that God is before all things. No in that there wasn't really such a thing as before the beginning, because time wasn't really existent. It wasn't really there. So how long did God sit around in nothingness before He actually started creating things? Well, that's not a valid question. There was not time before God created time. Something does not exist in absence of its own existence. So the fact is, at the very beginning of all things, the beginning of the world, the beginning of existence, the beginning of everything, God was already there. God is beyond what we can understand. And there's no way to explain Him already being there other than just to say, we don't get it. We don't understand Him. You see, God is eternal. There's a phrase we use to describe this. We say that God is the Alpha and the Omega. Now that's a phrase that's used 3 times in the entire Bible. All 3 times are in the book of Revelation. Revelation 1:8 says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty." Now, Alpha is the first letter in the Greek alphabet, which is what Revelation was written in. Omega is the last letter in the Greek alphabet. So that's like us saying God is the A to Z. He is everlasting. He is everything. He is beyond this concept of time. He is the first and the last. Now, this eternal nature of God, this is something that mankind has always known, but it's not something that we can really explain or comprehend. Job 36:26 says, "How great is God, beyond our understanding. The number of His years is past finding out." You can't comprehend, you can't number God's years. It's beyond us. John 1:1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, it goes on later to identify that Word as being Christ. And Christ was already there in the beginning with God. He is eternal. And here's the thing. When we think of God being eternal, oftentimes we think that means God never dies. He just has eternal life. And whereas that's true, I think it means something a little bit more than that. You see, God's not just immortal. God is beyond time. He's beyond eternity. He stands outside of this realm of time that limits us. If you open up a history book and you look at a timeline in a history book, you can see everything that happens on this timeline and you look at it all at once because you are standing outside of that timeline. Well, I think God stands outside of our concept of time in a very similar way. You see, time does not apply to God. So who's to say that God is not right now at this moment watching our church service? At the same time, He may also be watching Moses lead the Israelites through the desert. And at the same time, He may also be watching Jesus return to rapture the saints. God's beyond that. God is eternal. He's not limited by the things that limit us. Now, does this make sense to you? It probably should not make sense to you because this is not something that we can really fully understand. This is why we say God is beyond our understanding. Unfortunately, we're just going to have to live life not fully understanding it. It's funny because some people do think that they do understand it. 2 Peter 3:8 says, "Do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." Now, if you want my opinion, I think that's one of the most abused Bible verses there are. Because so many people look at that and treat it like a magical formula. They can just figure out when Jesus is going to return by plugging in certain numbers and figuring out God's timing. But the whole point of this verse is to say, you don't get God's timing. His timing is beyond ours. We don't understand Him. God is beyond time, and He's beyond our understanding. We call that eternal. Now, I like to watch a lot of old television shows and a lot of old movies and things. I think a lot of those are better than some of the new ones. One of the shows that I really like is The Twilight Zone. And I was watching an episode of The Twilight Zone the other day, and it's about this World War I fighter pilot. And he was flying around in his plane, and he ended up going through some strange cloud, and he landed in an Air Force base after World War II. And he's wondering what's going on, and people can't figure out how this World War I pilot was flying around in a battle back then, and then he suddenly ended up in World War II. And then at the end of the show, he gets off, he takes off in his plane, he flies back through the cloud, and he goes back to World War I, and he goes down in history as a war hero after he's already come to a future time. At the end of the show, everybody's sitting around saying, how could that have happened? That doesn't make any sense at all. And they ended it with a quote that I like, because they always end Twilight Zone with a really good quote. Ended it with a quote from Hamlet, from Act 1, Scene 5, in which Hamlet tells his friend, "There are more things in heaven and earth than dreamt of in your philosophy." There's more things out there than what we're capable of comprehending. We can't fully understand God. We can't understand how God stands outside of our concept of time, yet somehow He does. So, God is eternal. So what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what that means. That means that God is reliable. We know, for one thing, because God stands outside of time, time is not going to change God. Hebrews 13:8 says Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. God's not going to change over time like some people tend to. He's not going to be different from what He ever was. And because of this, God is the perfect place to put our trust. Not only is God reliable because of that, but if God stands outside of time, He's not limited by the present. That means He knows what's going to happen in the future. And if you ask me, the best place to put your trust is in someone who does not change, who knows what will happen, and who promises to still save your soul in spite of all of that. But we still don't fully understand God's eternal nature. But we don't have to. No one understands everything. No one does. And everyone trusts in something that they don't fully understand. And when we do that, that's simply called faith. God is eternal. He's beyond our understanding of time. Well, we can go back to Genesis 1:1. And it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, we may stop and wonder, what's He talking about when He says heavens? I'll tell you what I think this means. This means that God is beyond space. Now, by heaven, some people will think that refers to heaven, which is the realm, the heavenly realm where God and His angels dwell. But I think this refers to something a little bit more abstract than that. You see, in Jewish thought, many Jews believed that there were three realms of heaven. There was the first heaven, which was kind of this airy space where birds fly around. Beyond that, there was the second heaven, which is where the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon and everything, that's where they are. And then there was the third heaven, which is where God and His angels live. And that's why Paul writes in one of his letters that he knew a man who was caught up to the third heaven, someone who went up to actually to the realm, to the presence of God. And so Jews probably thought that. I'm guessing probably Moses thought something similar when he was writing down this creation account. And so he's thinking of God creating this open space. The skies, the outer space, everything. He's creating all of this. God created the dimensions for our understanding of location. Now that's kind of abstract and that may be a little difficult to get. But if God created space, God is beyond space. He's not limited by it. He's not contained by space. The Bible describes this as saying that God is just too big to be confined. 1 Kings 8:27 says, "But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built." You know, it describes God as being everywhere. Jeremiah 23:23, God says, "Am I only a God nearby and not a God far away? Can anyone hide in the secret places so that I cannot see Him, declares the Lord? Do not I fill heaven and earth?" And here's the thing, we don't understand that. Another thing about God we just don't get. We're limited by space. If I want to walk over to that pew, I can't just be at that pew. I have to travel there. I have to move. I'm only in one place at one time because I am limited. But where I am limited, God is limitless. God is limitless. Has anyone ever double booked yourself at one point or another? Have you ever needed to be at two places at the same time? In case you haven't figured it out yet, I'll share a secret with you. You can't do that. Because the fact is, you're limited. You occupy space. You are at one place at a time. And we know that's a limitation. That's why you see that on classic TV sitcoms all the time. Somebody has to be two places at once and they run back and forth and they make a big mess of things. I think it's funny that they do that. You know, we have a way of describing God's limitless nature in terms of space. We say He is omnipresent. Literally, He is all places. Because He's omnipresent, He's everywhere. Psalm 139:7 says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast." Now, we don't understand this exactly, but this should still be a comforting thought, because this means that the God who loves us never has to leave us. If I tell somebody, if you ever need me, I'll be there for you. I'll help you. You know, I can say that, but that's only so true. If somebody needs me, I can't be right there. They're going to have to pick up the phone. They're going to have to call me. I'm going to have to get in my car. I'm going to have to drive there. And after a certain amount of time, I'll be there. My presence will be there with them. But for God, that's not a limiting factor. God is always there with us. That's how God can be with a group of Christians meeting right here in Fairlawn Church of Christ in Galax, Virginia today. At the same time, He can be with a group of Christians meeting 100 miles away, 500 miles away on the opposite side of the earth. He's not limited by this space that limits us. Hebrews 13:5. It says, "Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, 'Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you.'" And God can hold to that promise perfectly because He never has to leave us, because He is beyond this concept of space. He is omnipresent. That's comforting. So let's go back real quick to Genesis 1:1 one more time. There's one more thing about God that can sort of stretch our mind a little bit. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So in other words, God's already created the heavens. He's already created this open space, and now He's putting the earth, He's filling it with stuff. He's putting stuff in the space. All things, all material things, ourselves included, fill up this space, and God has created us. Even this podium, maybe God did not make the podium directly, but He made the trees that made the wood that made this podium. God has created matter, and that means that God is beyond matter if He created it. You know, if I want to walk out into the aisle, first off, I have to step to the side of this podium. Or I have to climb over it. I have to push it out of the way because I'm limited by matter. But God is beyond that. God's not material. God is spiritual. Now, that's not to say God is only spirit, because God made Himself material in the person of Jesus Christ. God has mastery over the material. He's not limited by it. Again, we don't understand this. Here's the thing. As humans, we have a very unique existence. We are both physical and we are spiritual at the same time. We're material and spiritual. We live and material bodies in a material world, in a material realm, and we are surrounded by material things, but we still have a spiritual existence. God created us to be that way. Now, the only problem is that when we are surrounded by so many material things, oftentimes we can forget about spiritual realities. Sometimes, very, very subconsciously, we fall into this trap of thinking, you know, what's here, what's material, this is what is absolutely real. Anything beyond that, say something spiritual, probably real, but I don't know for sure that it's as real as what's material. But that's not true. Think about it this way. If God created the world, He created the matter, He created everything here. He's beyond all of that. That means that God is more real than any of that. In other words, even though I don't see God, I don't perceive God, God is more real than me or than you or this podium right in front of me that I can touch and I can feel and I can knock on and I can hear it. God is more real than that. Genesis 1:1 does not say, in the beginning was God. It does not say, in the beginning God existed. It just says, in the beginning, God. It assumes God is there because God is the absolute. He is definitive. Nothing is more real than Him. Exodus 3:13. When Moses was speaking to God and God was telling Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What is His name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." Who is God? God is. Period. There's nothing else to that. God is absolute. Even when God was in the person of Jesus Christ, He made the same claim. John 8:58, Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am." Now the Jews, the Pharisees at that time that hated Jesus, they would have exploded at this point because they would have immediately thought back to God telling Moses, "I am." They would say, this man was claiming to be God. That's wrong. Well, in His resurrection, though, He was justified in that claim. Now, God is more of a reality than this material world we exist in. That's not to say that this world is not real. But if anything is real, it's God. It's the one who created it. God is beyond matter, but we don't always understand what that means. I'll give you an example. I borrowed my wife's computer. Now, I want something to be very clear. I am not smart enough to build a computer. But let's pretend, just for the sake of this illustration, let's pretend I am smart enough to build a computer, and I built this computer. Okay, I don't know how a computer works, so this is unrealistic, but if I did know how a computer works, I would probably tell you that inside a computer there are tiny little electrical signals. That's how a computer works. It communicates, it stores information, it transmits by tiny little electrical signals that it sends back and forth inside this computer, inside this case. Now, for us to understand who God is, what God is, that would be kind of like me reaching down and talking to one of these little electrical signals in this computer I made and saying, "Hey, I'm here." How could that little electrical signal comprehend who I am? If it could even begin to comprehend who I am, it would say, "So what are you? You're like me, you're electrical, you're just bigger." Well, no, I'm not electrical, I'm biological. It wouldn't be able to comprehend that. And that's how far beyond us God's existence is. We cannot understand Him completely. God is beyond our understanding. So what? So God's beyond our understanding? Well, if God is beyond this material world, He created it, He has complete control over it. And that means God can do more than what we think of as possible. God is all powerful. Jeremiah 32:17 says, "Ah, sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you." And if God is all powerful, then He's worth relying on. Ephesians 3:20 says, "Now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us, to Him be the glory of the church and in Jesus Christ throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen." Jesus, God, He is beyond what we can understand. I saw a debate one time between a Christian and an atheist. And they were sort of going at it, and actually there was a Christian and two atheists, and one of the atheists asked the Christian a question that I'm sure everyone in here has heard. And I think to ask this question shows a massive lack of understanding. But he asked this Christian this question. He said, if God created the world, who created God? Now that's not a very smart question to ask. Essentially what that guy is saying is, I don't understand how anything could be here before matter, before the world was created like that. So really, if I don't understand it, it must not exist. Well, if this universe only consisted of things that I fully understand, there probably wouldn't be a lot of things in this universe because I don't understand that much. But he asked this question, if God created the world, who created God? And I love the response that the Christian gave to him. He said, if God could fit inside my 3-pound brain, He wouldn't be worth worshiping. God is beyond what I can wrap my mind around. God is limitless. He's not something I can understand. If He's limited to the same types of things that we are, so where I could understand Him, He'd just be like another person. There'd be nothing special. But God's beyond that. He's limitless. He's eternal. He's omnipresent. He is all-powerful. And for that, He deserves to be worshipped. A.W. Tozer once wrote, God dwells in a mode of being totally beyond us and wholly above us and infinitely removed from us. Yet when we think about God, we are trying to think about someone unlike anything we know. God says, who am I like, or to whom will you compare me? The answer being, nobody. Nobody's like God. Nothing's like God. God is like Himself. We dwell in matter and space and time, and we are creatures. God's not material. He does not dwell in matter. He isn't spatial. He doesn't dwell in space. He isn't temporal. He doesn't dwell in time. And He isn't a creature. God is a creator, not a creature. God was before any creature was. And as I have said before, nothing adds anything to God, and nothing can take anything away from Him. So what I want us to understand is that God, very simply, is beyond what we are capable of understanding. He is limitless. And we can never amount in any form of intelligence. We can never amount to comprehending all of God. So with that said, here's a question. Over the next couple of weeks, we're talking about understanding God better. If God really is limitless, if He's beyond our understanding, how in the world can we understand anything about Him? How can we have a relationship with a God who's so limitless? Well, we'll talk about that next week.